Hello and welcome. You're watching Oneindia News. This is our weekly show, Global Chit Chat, where we discuss the top developments in geopolitics with our guest and expert, Mr. Tridivesh Singh Maini. Hello, sir. Welcome back to our show.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So the first thing that we're going to talk about today, sir, is about the travel restrictions and how the International Air Transport Association, they are calling for a ban on all the barriers. They are saying that for all the fully vaccinated travelers, especially, to just remove all the barriers that are there. And also they are talking about for the unvaccinated travelers, if they can produce a negative COVID result, they are also saying that let them roam freely as well, because the money that is being used or allocated for testing travelers are being misused and they can be put to better use. So do you think that that makes sense? Do you think that COVID curbs are not really being enhanced, or the COVID is not really being put under control through these travel restrictions? Do you think this is the right call?
Okay. So basically, like all sectors, the tourism. If you look at tourism, it was hit significantly, and obviously, if you air connectivity, if you look at international tourism, obviously air connectivity is the main mode, right? Now,
Right.
now what has happened is that if you compare the figures of 2019 and 2020, 21, there has been a slight recovery, and 2022, analysts were expecting a better recovery in terms of it would obviously be down, it would be lesser than 2019, but if you look at the seat occupancy, if you look at the revenues, if you look at the overall figures, some sort of improvement. Now, what you have had ever since the end of November is that with the advent of the Omicron variant, newer restrictions came. Now, see, there are two schools of thought. One is if you have to also look at policies of various countries. So you have countries like China, which, as we have discussed earlier, have a zero COVID strategy. Then you have the United Kingdom, which has said that, I think on Monday they announced that they would open up. If you are doubly vaccinated, they would remove all restrictions. And I think what has also helped UK, obviously, is the large number of Omicron cases, which has helped to build immunity. But obviously, the economy took a hit and they took this approach. And then you have countries which have taken a middle of the ground, middle path, that you have certain restrictions in place, the double vaccination, RT-PCR and everything. Now, the question is that if you look at, it's already from 2000, as I said, 2000, it's virtually, end of certain countries obviously began to impose restrictions at the beginning of 2020. So the whole of 2020 and a significant portion of 2021 sort of just went with these numerous restrictions, and emergency flights were there. So for instance, for students or for people, if you look at emergencies and all, that all didn't get impacted. But if you look at certain countries which are dependent upon tourism, I mean, if you look at Southeast Asia, you look at the case of Thailand, you look at Vietnam, then even within South Asia, also look at a country like Sri Lanka. Obviously, the economies have taken a significant hit. And then amongst if you look at opening up, the first country which really opened up was Dubai because of the Expo. It's 2020. Now, you cannot afford a third year of tourism also being hit. Now you can't, but in 2022, you can't have this approach that apart from emergency travel, because obviously there's this argument that herd immunity has built up because of the Omicron variant. There's also the belief that now you're reaching endemic stage. But it's very tough to make that prediction whether you reach endemic stage. But irrespective of that, if you look at, as I said, countries are dependent upon tourism. Obviously, the service sector creates maximum number of jobs. So that is one part of it. If you look at the economies, then people also, have that sort of fatigue. So I think this makes sense that you actually look at, say, let's say if you have double vaccination to remove restrictions. And I think a lot of people are arguing that some countries may even say that only if you have double vaccination plus the booster, that is not going to work at all. That is going to be a strict no-no, because if you look at it logistically also, a lot of people who've got the double vaccination have been infected. So for at least another 3-4 months, they're not going to have a booster. Plus, every country can't afford boosters as well. So you need to have some sort of there needs to be synchronization. As it is, there's not been proper synchronization with regard to vaccination, as we've discussed earlier in the developing world. With regard to travel, you can't have a discriminatory approach that only if you
Right.
have double vaccination plus a booster plus that. So this makes perfect sense that all the money, all the resources which are going to be allocated towards extra testing and all can actually be put, met towards better use, and you can have whichever developing countries are lagging behind, you accelerate that. You first of all deal with the pandemic, and on the other hand also ease out travel and tourism, because as I've said, I mean, this is one sector which creates maximum jobs. It's also essential in any case, if you look at this whole thing of globalization also, people to people contacts, linkages and all, they're very essential. And it's not necessary that only that these travel and tourism are purely for pleasure also. It is uh, in many cases this leads to other business opportunities, this leads to other sort of linkages. So it's very important from a number of dimensions, and I think it's time that, yes, a slightly out of the box approach where a few
Right.
countries don't decide that, what, and also this discriminatory approach that, okay, if let's say next country cases suddenly go up, you suddenly impose ban, that all. And I also think that apart from maybe one or two countries like China has a zero COVID start, this embargoes also are out now. You cannot keep on going ahead with them. So I think if uh, countries listen to what IATA has to say, there is perfect sense. But unfortunately, even some of the even number of Western countries, democracies, also they have also, they have very like New Zealand is one country which has been sticking to this uh, zero COVID strategy, and then even if they open up, they'll have numerous restrictions. So this also needs to. I mean, there also needs to be synchronization with regard to the strategies, at least between uh, countries, and then also there are various blocks. So, for instance, one is obviously the larger multilateral organizations, but then you also have blocks of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You have other regional blocks. There can even be synchronization over there. That is one way also of doing it. So in South Asia, for instance, we have SAARC. There have obviously we have borders have been reasonably open within SAARC itself, but other regional blocks also need to do it. So this needs to be done at numerous levels, and it should not just be theoretical, and it should not be expected only of a few countries. There has to be a consensus over this. And I think
Right.
UK has done, both UK and Dubai in their own, in different ways, have actually shown that you can go ahead uh, with opening up ultimately with limited sort of restrictions.
Right. So ultimately, you think that it's better that if they just lift off everything and then allocate their funding to other things to curb the pandemic rather than wasting this money in the travel
Like,
restrictions and the tests and the quarantine, the isolation and everything that has come with it.
you can have one or two risks. You can, for instance, if you want, if somebody is not vaccinated, you can have a test, but then that
Right.
also should not necessarily be RT-PCR, maybe an
Right.
antigen. You'll have to ultimately liberalize that. That's one thing. Then if, and in any case, in large parts of the world, I mean, you do have double vaccination, so you can have that. So that's how you work at it, step by step,
Correct.
incrementally. But you need to too many restrictions that you have the testing also, then you have the quarantine, then you have, I mean,
Right.
that is not going to
Right. Right. Okay, this is the second thing that we're going to come to is the Russia-Ukraine situation. So, like we know that on Wednesday, the Normandy group met, and in the talks, Russia and Ukraine, for the first time since 2019, apparently, they have agreed to sign a joint statement and
work.
agreed to continue with the ceasefire talks, right? So, and they are also scheduled to have another round of talks in, I think, 2 weeks
Two
in
weeks.
Berlin.
Yeah.
So, do you think that this conversation, and America was not, of course, the part of this conversation, and America continues to resist Russia and their demands to ban not UK, sorry, Ukraine from the NATO. So, do you think that this is actually going to pan out in a positive way, or is it going to be a standstill yet again?
See, there are two layers to this. One is the bilateral. So obviously these talks, and for the first time since 2019, as you alluded to, there has been a joint statement. And obviously there's a clear consensus that you need to have a ceasefire. That you need to maintain the ceasefire, irrespective of whatever. Now there is a difference between, of course, the so for instance, the Russian representative. Uh, categorically said that there are two issues. One is the possible Russian entry into Ukraine is one thing, and the separatist issue that basically, if you look at Eastern Ukraine and this issue of rebels over there, that is one thing. So obviously, there's no doubt that the fact that at least they've gone ahead and said that after 2 weeks we're going to stick to the ceasefire is important. But that is one level. Then the other is the Russia-US sort of relationship, and obviously the NATO angle. So US has again categorically said that that we are willing to talk to Russia, and the US Secretary of State has offered the diplomatic path, but he has said that as far as entry into NATO is concerned, we are not going to give any sort of assurance or whatever. Now, there are many in the US actually. If you look at realists, some of the IR thinkers like Mershmer and Walt and all, they have basically said that US is to blame. That why had if you look at the issue, for instance, of NATO wanting to be part of Ukraine wanting to be part of NATO and everything. The US again should have basically viewed this from the prism of sort of one self-interest, and second, not pushing Russia to the corner. So that is, there are realists in the US who believe that the West is also to blame. They're critical of the liberal thinking that we need to intervene and all that. So if you look at as such, if you look at the aggression by Putin also. It is posturing, and obviously, as we've discussed earlier, that he sensed, the overall the point that there's this global vacuum, and obviously, US is engrossed in other issues. If you look at the Middle East, right, it has drawn flack for its handling of Afghanistan. So, seeing this whole flux, the Russian president, one obviously wants to increase his domestic popularity, and also to sort of show that he means business. But the buildup of troops obviously is sort of serious business. And 2014 also, there was a similar situation. Obviously, Russia had sensed that if you look at the US, there's a gradual. It's tough to be dismissive of the US, but gradual decline in terms of its overall leverage and everything. So part of it is obviously if you look at geopolitics, it's obviously driven a lot one by the domestic factor, that you want to send out a message domestically that you mean business. If there are other problems or economic problems or issues like that, that's one thing. The second is it's always a tussle between great powers. So on the one hand, you have China becoming more aggressive. So Russia obviously doesn't want to be left too far behind. And then you have the factor also, Russia has a very strong leverage vis-a-vis Europe, especially vis-a-vis Germany, because of its dependence upon Russia for gas, for all its energy needs and all that. And then you also have this Nord Stream pipeline, which has been a bone of contention between US and Germany. It hasn't begun as yet, but obviously, in fact, the US had waived sanctions for this Nord Stream. So now the issue is that how does the United States ensure that, because as we've been discussing earlier, Russia is important. The Russia-US, even for Russia also the US has significance. But this is a bone of contention. Now, a lot will depend upon the role of other countries. So as you had said, this Normandy group, and if another 2 weeks they can again sort of, we also need to see that the public statements are one thing. You need to actually decipher the actions, and what are the little bit posturing should be allowed. You should give some space also to leaders, to if they make belligerent remarks or whatever. But it was a build-up of troops which sent out the sort of signaling. But irrespective of the outcome, it's a bigger test for Joe Biden than it is for Putin. So, and also what is also the other problem was, I think, some remarks, some of the comments. So, for instance, he had distinguished between a type of invasion, whether it's a full-scale invasion. He had during one of his speeches that a full-scale invasion will receive a much stronger reaction. and he's also spoken about sanctions. Now, economic sanctions, obviously, I don't think are a major issue. Russia is probably ready, even though they've said that they'll impose sanctions on Russian banks and now even on individual and Putin. So sanctions have been used as a tool, whether it's Iran, North Korea, and numerous countries. And Russia obviously thinks that it has a wherewithal to deal with the sanctions. But ultimately, it will all be determined by one, the US actual the strength which it has, mixed with its ability with some deft diplomacy. And as for Russia, it depends upon what approach, whether Putin wants to go to a certain point and say that I've sent my message and I'm done with this. Otherwise, this tussle about whether you can, this whole thing about everybody wants to have this phase of influence about, and also about whether Ukraine should be part of NATO or not. We may also, I mean, obviously, we need to underscore the point that the US, Trump himself was very critical of NATO itself. There have also been debates within the West about NATO. So that is something also. There are those in the US, for instance, who believe that the US should not invest significantly, and that is a realist school of thought. So even domestically, whether there can be some, even the US also needs to probably show some degree of pragmatism. If Ukraine is itself inclined, let them do their lobbying on that behalf. The US should not be making this a bone of contention beyond a point. Behind the scenes, you can influence Ukraine in whatever way. But as I said, a lot is about the posture.
China's top foreign policy expert said that absolute national security approach that the country has undertaken is not a viable way, and he has cited the example of USSR, saying that they did take the completely, they used to spend a lot on defense and they did not look at long term security, and they should he insisted that China should learn from USSR and make sure that that doesn't happen. So can you just explain the backdrop to which this statement was made?
Okay, so this has come these arguments were made in a journal, journal of published by Beijing University. And so in that, basically, now there are two things. One, he has been a dean of international affairs of the university. And second, he's also member of the China People's Political Consultative Conference, which is an important decision-making body. Now, there are two things to be seen. One, earlier also, last month, a former Chinese ambassador to the US had made remarks about the fact that China should be less aggressive vis-a-vis the US. So this policy could be counterproductive. Then, if you look at the Chinese economy, there has been some veiled criticism of Xi Jinping's approach. And now, very interesting, there were three things. One is that you need to take a comprehensive approach towards security. When you look at national security, you don't need to get obsessed with one particular aspect. And obviously, that is where he has he's brought in the erstwhile Soviet Union and how they spent excessively on defense and the pitfalls of that sort of approach. So now one can read it in different ways. I mean, obviously, this first of all means that, as we've been saying earlier, that domestically there is no. Many times you think that there's this monolithic sort of thinking and everybody is blindly behind
abiding to it.
His belligerent approach, especially on geopolitical issues. So now to first of all to talk about a comprehensive approach towards security, and then to bring in to flag an example, for instance, of use it as a red flag rather, that what happened with the USSR is very important. And I think also if you compare it, or if you sort of add up with what I said, senior diplomat had also said, this obviously means this is largely because at this point of time, when you look at security issues, obviously China has problems in South Asia. There are problems in the Indo-Pacific. If you look at Taiwan, if you look at Southeast Asia, but this is driven largely by the China-US sort of rivalry itself. US believes it has certain spheres of influence, especially in Southeast Asia or China believes it has certain spheres of influence. So it's essentially the China-US relationship, which means that there is a belief that even the China-US relationship needs to be redefined. Now, if you look at the approach in recent months, nothing significant has happened on the ground. Unlike the US-Russia relationship, where certain headway has been made, and even in the talks, the US has always said that we need to leave some windows open for negotiation. That's not happening as such, and this is also very much in uh, contrast to while when comparisons are made between Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong, but Mao Zedong had argued that you can have your with neighbors and all, you can have conflict, you can have tensions, but with countries which are far away, you must have good relations. This was made specifically in the context of ties with the US. So this is something which, to what point is Xi Jinping willing to push the conflict with the US? Agreed. I mean, you can argue that a lot of countries that they are dependent upon China economically. US is also dependent upon China economically, but you may also want to see that if you look at countries like Australia, if you look at Canada, even if you look at UK, gradually they're beginning to look at alternatives. If you look at UK's policy, for instance, it is, and we're not just only talking about the US. Even if you look at US allies, so UK is looking now at the Indo-Pacific. Australia is looking. Uh, China imposed tariffs. Australia is looking at alternative markets. Canada was also going to probably, obviously, to adopt a similar approach, even as the Huawei. And as it is, the relationship is downhill. So there are limits. And generally, the earlier the Chinese approach has been that okay, it has been argued by analysts that Chinese, they'll push you to a point, they'll contain you. But in the case of Xi Jinping, he is it's quite the approach is obviously far more belligerent, and obviously he believes in a zero sum sort of approach. On if you look at even with if you look at South Asia, now there are as I said, for posturing, for sending a message, this sort of approach is fine. But to what point do you want to go? And also, you generally want to create, if you look at diplomacy, generally it's about creating a wedge between, so for instance, between the US and but you are pushing countries closer to the US, right? And so the root cause, one, obviously, the China-US relationship, again, both sides, analysts would argue that they need to slightly calm down the tempers. And like US and Russia, you can see that there are certain areas where you will have to work together, especially even not just climate change, even if there are energy shortages and disruptions like that. They've tried to work that out. The other is that you also don't push. I mean, what is happening is other countries are being forced, and China probably thought that many countries, especially if you look at Australia, if you look at UK or Canada, that they would not make these decisive choices on issues like Huawei and other. Now that hasn't panned out that way. They've tilted towards the US. And also this thing about probably what Biden has done more successfully than Trump is that at least on certain issues he's managed to get countries together. He has spoken about democracies working together. And while on the ground there is no alternative as such, as we have said, in terms of trade and economics and everything else, but some attempts are being made. So the the more nuanced the US is vis-a-vis China, the tougher it will be for China. And that's a lesson for Washington as well. That they should refrain, from basically the policy should not be an imitation. It should be a layered approach. Yes, so for instance, on national security, on tech, that approach is fine. Even on trade, you can't totally give in to China. But your policy can not only be imposing sanctions, tariffs, embargoes, restrictions, and everything else. There has to be some nuance to it. And China, on the other hand, as well, the last few weeks have clearly shown that I think Xi Jinping's leadership at times has been overestimated, even by the West itself. They're not paying much attention to the fault lines within China itself.
Correct. Correct. And this was pointed out by a Chinese official himself. Correct. So this was not even like a US saying that stop doing it, it's gonna bring trouble, but it's them themselves, they're realizing it. So do you think that they're gonna actually realize, and is there a possibility of Xi Jinping to actually concede to this policy and stop imposing, like you said, everything?
So I think no leader wants to sort of confess that they've gone wrong, or that the
And
policy.
he's gonna complete 10th year of his
Yeah.
rule, so called,
Yes.
in
Yes.
the
But
next year.
but but I think a slightly better relationship with the United States and vice versa would give both. I mean, so you obviously have your theaters of conflict. I mean,
Right.
nobody said that is bound to be there. Whenever there is a great power rivalry, that's going to be there.
Mm.
But you keep some doors open, and
Mm.
also the other important thing is, I think apart from the bilateral relationship, it's very important to keep a close watch on which way do US allies having
Mm.
close economic ties with China, uh, which way do they veer? I mean, they moved, and that so far has given some clear indicators that some of them are willing to make choices and work closely, because human rights issues, Hong Kong, that has been a major binding
Mm.
factor between.
Mm.
Apart from obviously the COVID-19 pandemic,
Mm.
its origins,
Mm.
and then if you also look at economic policies, a number of countries have come up with this approach. If you look at the mergers and acquisitions and everything, they've come up with policies to prevent Chinese companies from taking over, especially in sensitive areas. Now, next
Mm.
step is even if you look at education, if you look at the STEM subjects, if you look at things related to information technology, all these, whether it's Australia, whether it's UK, and
Mm.
possibly even Canada, they're going to prevent Chinese, they're going to, no, there's no, I mean, obviously Chinese students will be encouraged, but in
Mm.
certain subjects, they will discourage them from enrolling. So these are
Mm.
things which are very
Right, right. Right. So thank you for joining us today, sir.
important.
And then we'll
Pleasure.
see you next week again. Catch us on Global Chit Chat. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.